So this story begins 26 years ago when the Soviet Union fell apart, and along with it, control over the largest arsenal of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons ever created. It was uncharted and perilous waters. And as the Soviet Union fell apart, two visionary senators, Sam Nunn from Georgia and your own Senator Dick Lugar from Indiana, passed legislation called the NunnLugar Act that established the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program to help us deal with this new challenge, not of a strong Soviet Union threatening the United States, but a weak, collapsed state, perhaps unable to prevent the theft or diversion of weapons of mass destruction and the related materials and expertise. I was a young diplomat, and I was flying home from Germany, and I read an article in the Wall Street Journal, and it said, American Embassy, Kazakhstan, looking for diplomats who find Paris a bore. And it was an article about how this new country called Kazakhstan had inherited over 1,200 nuclear weapons. It had become the fourth largest possessor of nuclear weapons in the world. And I thought, what an exciting opportunity for me. So I volunteered to go there. I had been working on countering Libya's weapons of mass destruction programs in my prior assignment. So this seemed like a great opportunity. So here I am, after learning Russian language for 1 year, arriving in 1993 in Almaty, Kazakhstan, in the Tian Shan, or Heavenly Mountains, in really uncharted waters, in a new country. And we hadn't mapped the locations of these weapons of mass destruction. The facilities were scattered across 11 time zones in the most isolated, remote areas. Many of these cities didn't appear on maps. They were just known by post office box numbers. They were so secret. And shortly after I arrived in Kazakhstan, I had been there for just a month or so, I was approached by my car mechanic, and he asked me if I would be interested in buying some uranium. So there were a lot of scams going on at the time, and I was very skeptical, but how can you not follow up something like this? So I pursued it. And my relationship with him led to an introduction to the director of a factory in East Kazakhstan near the border with Mongolia, China, and Russia. His name was Vitaly Mete. And I became good friends with him. He invited me elk hunting in the Altai Mountains. And we bonded. And over a period of several months, he gave me increasingly more information about this uranium that had been left over in his factory from a secret Soviet nuclear submarine reactor program. And indeed, eventually, I learned through him that Kazakhstan had inherited in this warehouse enough highly enriched uranium to produce dozens and dozens of nuclear weapons. We were invited by President Nazarbayev on a secret visit to this facility to verify the presence of this material. And here is just one of many buckets filled with this heavy metal. It's uranium enriched to 90% uranium-235, immediately weapons usable. And this was all protected by a good padlock. And we reported that back to Washington. what to do? What to do? This was uncharted waters. And together with the government of Kazakhstan, the government of the United States took a bold gamble. And we decided to launch a secret project together to safely package these materials and fly them back to the United States for safekeeping. Why? Because we were concerned that countries like Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and even North Korea were also seeking these materials throughout the former Soviet Union. And we wanted to get it out of there. And so we launched this project in secret, and I remember like yesterday, after we had spent about 5 weeks packaging the material and then loading it onto these trucks when it was most vulnerable for the movement to the airport at 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were racing against winter. That night, the roads had black ice on them, and these trucks that you see in this convoy, I was in the lead security vehicle as part of an armed escort. They were sliding on the black ice, and I shuddered to think that I would have to report to Washington that one of these trucks had slid off a bridge into the Irtysh River and was floating downstream. But luckily that didn't happen. We made it safely to the airport and loaded 2 C-5 Galaxy aircraft for one of their longest flights in history, literally halfway around the planet, back to the United States without any stops, with 3 aerial refuelings en route. And when this project was completed, when the material was safely secured in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, we announced to the world this accomplishment. It was truly defense by other means. One of the largest intelligence failures of the Cold War was that we missed the Soviet biological weapons program. We signed a treaty with them and other countries in 1975, the Biological Weapons Convention. And as the ink was drying on that treaty, the Soviet Union decided to ramp up its biological weapons program. And this building here that I'm standing in front of is in a place called Stepnogorsk, Kazakhstan. It was one of those secret cities that was never on a map. And that building is 2 football fields long. It was the world's largest anthrax factory. And we were invited by President Nazarbayev to make a secret visit to this facility. And I led the first American team there in June of 1995. And confronted with this, what to do? We didn't have a playbook. These were uncharted waters. So what we did, with the approval of the government of Kazakhstan, we signed a contract with the very people who built this facility and operated this facility to destroy it safely and methodically. Here is one of 10 4-story high fermenters, bioreactors. The entire fermentation hall was at biosafety level 4 high containment. The workers wore spacesuits with breathable air. This facility was capable of producing, during a wartime mobilization period of about 8 months, of 300 metric tons of anthrax. The scale can only be called evil. But thanks to the NunnLugar program and our partnership with the government of Kazakhstan that decided to reject weapons of mass destruction, if you were to go there today, you would just see grass growing where that horrific building once stood. This is an island in the Aral Sea called Возрождение Island that we visited in June of 1995. It was the site of the Soviet Union's open-air biological weapons testing facility. They would, in one test, expose about 100 monkeys or other animals to biological weapons agents, and then bring them back into high containment laboratories to observe the onset of disease and evaluate the effectiveness of their biological weapons. The Soviet Army, we learned from a defector, had buried over 100 tons of anthrax agent in 11 pits on this island. And after 9/11, we became concerned that this could be recovered by terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. So we did a joint project with the government of Uzbekistan to dig up these pits and thoroughly decontaminate and destroy what had remained of this anthrax agent. So that was another example of dealing with the legacy of these threats in a way that permanently eliminated the threat. Here I am in Kiev, Ukraine, with a brand new junior senator from Illinois. It's at a public health laboratory, and he looks concerned, and it's because from this kitchen-like refrigerator behind me, the director of the health lab handed me this tray with vials of Bacillus anthracis. That's the bacteria that causes anthrax. And we mapped many facilities like this throughout the Soviet Union. We were concerned that groups like Al-Qaeda and later ISIS could get their hands on these seed materials, starter cultures, to develop biological weapons for terrorist attacks. And we had a big program to consolidate and secure these dangerous pathogen collections, some of which had been left over from the Soviet biological weapons program. Now we're very concerned not just about these traditional biological weapons, but that advances in science and synthetic biology and gene editing make it possible to develop novel, enhanced pathogens as biological weapons. And countries like North Korea, although we don't hear about it because the news is dominated by their nuclear weapons and missile programs, they have been applying these new scientific tools to developing more deadly biological weapons. And we need to pay attention to this. I believe it's perhaps more likely that they would use biological weapons than nuclear weapons because they could do it with a fig leaf of denial. Chemical weapons are also a threat. Last month, President Putin announced that Russia had completed the destruction of the Cold War chemical weapons arsenal of 40,000 tons of chemical weapons. What he failed to mention was that the NunnLugar program, with about $1 billion of your tax dollars, built a facility in Russia in a place called Shuchi that destroyed a large portion and helped Russia destroy a large portion of that Cold War arsenal. In Libya, which I had worked on in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I had the opportunity to visit a remote location deep inside of Libya at a place called Wadan. And I'm holding there the last of 517 artillery shells that were filled with mustard gas that could have been used by terrorists as an improvised chemical device. I had the pleasure of flying back by helicopter and then fixed wing to Tripoli that day, and I was pulled aside by the lead chemical engineer who said, "Andy," he said, "today's the proudest day of my life." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Since the mid-1980s, I was hired to work on Gaddafi's chemical weapons program. I helped build the factories and produce these chemical weapons, and today I had the honor of leading the project to destroy the last of them, and these weapons will never fall into the hands of terrorists." And it's people like him who are the real champions of this effort. And I learned in my career that it's individuals who make projects like this happen. They don't just happen because bureaucracies say we should do this. You really need champions. I'm also very concerned about fentanyls. The president today announced that it's a public health emergency, the opioid crisis. But what people don't realize is that fentanyls are also a chemical weapon that could be used by terrorists. In fact, in 2004, in Moscow, Chechen terrorists seized a theater like this, and the Russian special forces, through the air handling system, inserted fentanyls. And they used too much. They killed all 40 hostage takers, but also they killed over 100 of the hostages themselves. So fentanyls are not just a health threat, but they're a national security concern. And this is truly a new, uncharted water that going forward we need to pay close attention to. We also had an amazing project with over 30 countries involved, including the United Nations, to remove and destroy 1,300 tons of serious chemical weapons. And that was accomplished with leadership from the Department of Defense, technology developed by the US Department of Defense, but a true partnership between Russia, the United States, China, and European countries. And that's 1,300 tons of chemical weapons that will never be used against the Syrian people, will never be acquired by terrorists like ISIS, and will never present a strategic threat to Syria's neighbors. Nuclear weapons. A lot of people think they went away with the Cold War. We still have in the world 15,000 nuclear weapons, many of them over 100 times more powerful than the two that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II. Unfortunately, I believe that we're at as much risk, if not even greater risk, of an accidental nuclear war today than even during the Cold War. And this is something that is really uncharted waters, very dangerous, that your generation is going to have to deal with. President Obama moved the ball on this with his Prague speech, where he laid out a vision of a world free of nuclear weapons, but it's going to take a lot of work, and I believe that we're at the tipping point of a possible new nuclear weapons arms race, not just involving two countries, but involving many more countries that currently possess nuclear weapons. So I have a request of you, and it's based on the privilege that I've had in working on these programs and reducing weapons of mass destruction threats. And I would ask each of you to consider whether you're an aspiring scientist who could develop new drugs and vaccines to prevent biological weapons, or an aspiring journalist or an aspiring public servant, to consider carrying on this work to prevent catastrophe, to prevent weapons of mass destruction. Because, as President Obama said, we simply cannot allow the 21st century to be darkened by the worst weapons of the 20th century. Thank you.